To start off here, one of the main things I noticed was that when this Mei was countering us, we didn't sit and poke before going on to point, which is a pretty vital thing when you're dealing with a Mei, because you want to burst her down or at least scare her into her icicle before you go on to point as a comp like Goats that doesn't really want to split up. But really, if we're not able to do that, the best thing that we can do is just to switch to range damage. I think that's a call that really should have been made after losing that first fight, and with us not really switching it up that much or not committing to a completely different comp, we weren't able to successfully fight against them. It really should have been a call that someone made to just go to, if we would have gone to ranged damage and poked them, perhaps killed them before going in, then we would have had a much better chance against them in this very first round. Another thing I wanted to mention is that our mechanical skill is much lower compared to them. They're masters, so we really needed to outplay them with our abilities instead of trying to outsnipe them or outplay them just by shooting them and killing them quicker. You obviously can't win a Widow 1v1 and inflict to their headshot sooner when they're such a higher degree of skill than you. The main problem with how we weren't able to outplay them with our abilities is that we ended up swapping a lot and we didn't build up ults. We might have been able to build up ults quicker. I think we just died really soon in the fights before we could get any of our damage off, and because of that we never built up a lot of our ults really quickly. And then we also did all of those swaps, like I said, so that's giving up all of that ult charge. We only ended up building a couple of ults in that first round, and the couple of ults that we did build, we really failed to use them together. I know Doughboy went in for that big shatter after he got walled and he got a pick on the Moira, but I still think it might have been a better usage of that if we could have comboed that with another sort of ability and possibly gotten more value out of it. On to the next fight here. I made a pretty fatal mistake by not sticking with the tanks and really trying to go on my own flanker mission. You can tell right here that they definitely called out where I was and focused me down really quickly before I could do anything about it. This leads into a very important message that I want to get across, and that's using the space that your tanks make for you. In this specific instance, I really didn't use any of the space that the tanks made for us at all. Our tanks weren't pushed up far enough for them to be distracted for my flanking to be successful, and I also wasn't behind the Orisa shooting at them from the big shield that she gave us. This ended up being a theme throughout the rest of the game, where we ended up having some trouble just utilizing the space that the tanks are making for you. So I thought I'd kind of put together this diagram for y'all. If you think of tanks like circles, like here's a circle here and here's a circle here, and DPS kind of like lines. The way that tanks do damage and make space is that they prevent this enemy DPS from walking into the circle here. Think of these circles like insta-kill circles. So if an enemy DPS, say this is the enemy DPS, if he walks into this circle, he just instantly dies. That's a good way to think about how tanks make space, because essentially, it's obviously not instant, but essentially that's what tanks do, is if you get too close to a tank, all of their abilities tend to be very close range, and very effective at close range. So they can burst down a squishy pretty quickly at close range. Think of like Reinhardt's hammer has a certain radius around him where he can protect his teammates just by killing anyone that comes into that space. The DPS, on the other hand, their abilities are very long-ranged. So whatever they're looking at, it's obviously varies depending on the DPS, but whatever they're looking at, they can kill from a distance. I'll make this red. So he can shoot that guy from a distance. The problem is that guy can also shoot him from a distance. And at that point, when it's just DPS v DPS, it's whoever has the best mechanical skill that wins that duel, or whoever's playing the counter of the other DPS. But what if there was this revolutionary idea where you could put one of your DPS within where one of your tank's bubbles is? Meaning that if another tank tried to get close to take on this DPS or distract this squishy, they wouldn't be able to jump on this squishy and kill the DPS or distract the DPS or harass the DPS because the DPS is within the tank's bubble. And if they go walk in that bubble, they're going to get killed. Healers are also involved here because they have to heal up the tanks and the DPS, but they do the same thing that the DPS are supposed to do, which is kind of stay within the tank's bubbles here, and the tank will be able to protect them. And tanks can protect people in different ways too. I'll make this a plus sign so you can think of it as more of like a healer. But different tanks have different ways of creating that space. Reinhardt has a shield, so he protects everything behind him, like so. And also, anyone that aggresses on him with closer damage, say another tank, he'll be able to fight them with his hammer, which is in this smaller but still very effective bubble. Different tanks do things in different ways. For instance, Winston has a very large bubble because he can do damage from a much longer range than Reinhardt. Still very close range, but a much longer range. The way he can make space is with his jump, because his jump is on a 4-second cooldown. So he can go in and aggress enemies. Say this green guy here is a DPS that he's aggressed onto and he is taking on. But he can do that and he can aggress on these enemies, but then also jump backward so that he can maintain another bubble of space where, say, his healer and his DPS is. And essentially keep two little pockets of space that he's making. Both one on the enemy DPS to keep the enemy DPS distracted and harassed and lower HP. It could be possible that their mercy or their healer has to pocket their DPS because he's getting so low when Winston jumps on him. So by doing that, by making that space within the enemy's lines, Winston is able to distract both a healer and a DPS, while also being able to jump back and protect his own healer and his own DPS with all of this space that he's creating in these two separate pockets. Other tanks have other abilities, like Roadhog is very deadly in this close range, but a really good Roadhog that knows how to use his right click and his hook can be also very deadly in a much longer range with his hook. and his right click, which would deny enemy squishies from taking up space around him very close. So really, as a tank, what you're looking for in your positioning is to both protect your DPS here in your little pockets of space behind your shield, or within your range of your damage abilities in the case of Roadhog. But as a DPS or a support, what you need to understand is how to utilize these pockets of space. And the best way you can do that is by standing behind whatever shield is up, say Winston's barrier sometimes, or Reinhardt's shield, and not necessarily getting in front of it to fight enemies, but staying back behind it where you're safe from a Widow headshot or another DPS's over-aggression. That's really the best way you can utilize that space, because if you think of Reinhardt, he's useless when he has his shield up alone. He can't do damage to an enemy while he has his shield up, so what is he supposed to do? He's supposed to protect his DPS and his healers behind him, and they're going to get all of the value out of that shield. But if no one's behind him, and no one is utilizing that shield, he's essentially just not even a part of the team. He's not preventing anything from happening, and it's a 5v6. So just think about that next time you play, and while you're playing, think about how to utilize this space. Think about being able to stay within line of sight of your Winston so that he can jump to you and protect you when that's needed. Stay about being within hook range of Roadhog so that Roadhog can hook the Tracer that's been chasing you the whole game. Brigitte is a really good example. If you stand right next to Brigitte, almost nothing can jump on top of you because she can shield bash them and kill them right away. But that was my long, drawn-out over-explanation of what tanking is supposed to achieve and how to utilize the space with tanking. Right here at the very beginning of this next engagement, I'm going to pick on Specs here, but I'm sure we all did it at some point. What he's doing is engaging at a moment where the rest of the team is either dead or coming back from spawn. In a situation like this, it's hard to say, because if you were patient and you had a good sightline on a healer that you knew you could hit a headshot on and guarantee a kill, it might swing the tide in our favor, and we might be able to win the fight because of it. But at this moment in time, we were just coming out of spawn, and we weren't really ready to attack the enemy team yet because we were so far back behind. So engaging them, even when you can guarantee a kill, is really, really risky because you're alone at this point. And they can jump on you, they can focus fire you, and they can kill you. And if they kill you, then we're fighting a 5v6 instantly. Moving on here, later, we ended up getting a pretty good regroup and positioned the way we really should for the most part. But I'm having a little bit of trouble of really seeing where it went wrong. And where I think it went wrong was that we tunnel visioned forward and we didn't really see the Pharah that was looking for an ult. If you see a Pharah flying toward you like that, where she's still shooting you, but she looks like she's trying to get above you, or above a bunker, a team, or in this spot where she's not easily shot at, you should really call it out and pay attention, because she's looking for an ult. Broman did really good by running away here. It was a lost fight after we lost the 3 to the barrage, but then he came out of ball mode and started to shoot the enemy. Whenever you do something like this, you've got to ask yourself why you're doing it. You can't realistically expect to win a 1v3 at a fourth of your health. I think the better option here was to just keep rolling away, hopefully not dying, and getting back to spawn and regaining all of your health so that we can get a quicker regroup and punch right back at them. What happened instead is that they got fed ult charge from Wrecking Ball, and we had to wait for Broman's respawn timer, which delayed our second engagement and gave them a bunch more percentage points on their control meter. Coming up on this next fight, I really like this play. This is an instance where we use an ability for the benefit of the entire team instead of just using it to chase kills ourselves. The halt really guaranteed a kill on that Zarya, not necessarily because Doughboy killed her, but because she was pulled into both of the DPS's sightlines without any abilities to save her. We saw that she already popped her first bubble on herself, and so she didn't have another bubble to protect herself. And she was so far away from her own team that they couldn't realistically protect her either way. It's a good example of playing reactively instead of playing proactively. We knew she couldn't bubble herself again, and so we abused that. This also led into another instance where I, as the McCree here, used this space that the tanks made for me. I stood behind the shield and I fought with the Orisa, and I think that's a large reason why we won the fight. I think to some degree I didn't have to use the High Noon here. We weren't really using any of our other abilities, and we had already won that fight. I like the idea of me using it as insurance to make sure we do capture it, because we had a hard time capping it in the first place, but saving it for a re-engage if they capped it again, or if they were pushing way up on us and we didn't have anything to parry back at them, would have been a better option, especially if I could combo it with someone else's ult. A call for the Mercy on the right side here, as soon as you killed the Pharah, would have been a bit more helpful, as we could have followed up for the kill. One of the biggest issues at this point, however, was the lack of mobility to protect our Widow. Broman's switch over to the Rhine made it so that our Widow really didn't have a peel if she was in danger. So I think that we could have definitely coordinated it better so that we still had a mobility tank, or at least an enforcer like Tracer, to protect the Widow in case she got jumped on. We really should have called for a rotation sooner here and rotated all together, because the Orisa and I rotated without the Bastion and our Rhine shield was down. We were split in two and effectively surrounded. Broman also chased the Lucio for a pick here instead of really regrouping with the Hog and the rest of the team, or just dying outright. And then here's another bad one. We pushed up toward the choke but didn't really go for a contest, which is fine, but then we also didn't back up to the choke. Our Bastion's line of sight was severely limited because the bridge is curved upward, as you can see here. They weren't really running a very shield break heavy comp at all. It just happened to be that we put our shields in the wrong places and the Bastion couldn't really see because of the curved bridge, so that the shields naturally got bursted down before the Bastion could find any picks. Here's another minor mistake. Winston went in for an engage, which meant that all of us really should have followed him as soon as he got on. Think of tanks like your protectors, your shields. Like I said earlier when I was trying to explain how to use space in my little MS Paint thing, they make it safe to get close to the enemy team. So at least Reaper, it's debatable with Ana whether she should have jumped down, because she had good sightlines on both teammates and enemies from the high ground there. Should have dropped with Winston at the same time for the engagement and really got in their faces. Reaper is a character that you want to get as close to the enemy as possible, because that's where you're most effective and you'll do the most damage. And if you jump on someone with a Reaper and a Winston at the same time, the Winston can kind of act as the enforcer to force the enemies away from him and into the Reaper. Or the combo of the Winston and a Reaper's quick burst damage could just kill a target outright. By the time Reaper did drop here, Winston was already low on health and abilities. We ended up all tunnel visioning on our own separate targets and didn't really take a single one of them down. Some of us were out of healer sightlines, which made it all worse. Moving on to the next fight here, I actually mentioned it in game, but we tried to take an engagement without tanks. The squishies end up with no protection or space and are really easily picked off. You need those bubbles of space with your tanks to protect you from that really quick burst damage that the enemy team can do. Or if the enemy team was running dive, a tank would protect you from getting dived. Afterward here was another instance where Broman went in alone. Because of this, the fight that followed instantly was just a 5v6. We need to calm down and just be patient, stop being so flustered and trying to make these big plays on our own. If we wait for our team to spawn and group up together, if we use the space that our tanks create for us, then we can be a lot more successful. We had lots of time at this point to regroup at the choke, it was just we didn't. Right here was one of the biggest plays of the match, and I'm very proud of what happened here. We could have waited slightly longer for a few more people to be able to dive on point together, but we managed to have 4 people all engaged at the same time, and it really swung the fight. My nano heal on the Winston really helped, and Doughboy did a great job of not only utilizing the extra health as a surprise, but also all of the damage and damage resistance he was given. He split up their team, just the way he jumped, split up the enemy team so that they tunnel visioned into different targets on our team and took different paths that took their tanks away from their DPS so that their DPS wasn't easily protected and their tanks weren't easily protected and their healers weren't easily protected. A minute later here, when we're still kind of fending them off, the Blossom and the Dragon that we did was, I would say it's very unnecessary to use either one at this point, especially both of them. Going for the Brig swap was smart, I'd say, but we all should have backed up as soon as he said that. We were fighting a 5v6 without specs. Moving on to the attack round here, what we should have done throughout this push was switch to high mobility DPS and go around the left side where we're out of the Widow's sightlines. The Lucio isn't really a boop threat to Tracer or Genji as long as they can manage their cooldowns to stay on the pathway. Part of the big issue here was our lack in committing to a specific team comp. We had dive tanks for a while, so I switched to Genji, but then Broman switched to Hog, and in both cases we had a Brigitte, which doesn't satisfy the win condition of either dive or shield break, because she wants to get in and fight them. What we should have done is played for diving Widow in the bunker. Doughboy was getting good engages by himself, he just needed some people to be able to go in with him. In the end, we never really committed to a specific comp, and the Widow really got the best of us. Another thing I'm noticing is that we're increasingly taking these 1v1 exchanges with the other team, like the Tracer 1v1 with specs that he had here. This wouldn't normally be a big problem, but the fact that they're masters and they're much higher skill mechanical made it so that we'd fare much better off fighting as an entire unit. Moving on to Horizon here, we had a really good hold. Almost a full hold. We stayed really close to each other and fought on point like we should have. The downfall was when we started chasing the enemy and getting split up by ults. We got whittled down into 1v1s which were unfavorable to us, and we ended up losing the fight. Just a small tip for specs here. Instead of matrixing enemies, what you could have done is matrixed the grav. We most likely would have lost the fight anyway, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Over here is another instance where we really shouldn't have used ults because it was already a losing fight. And lastly, hindsight is 20/20, but we should have really switched to a different comp by now. That kind of wraps up what I wanted to do for the VOD review. It took a long time to write all this down and try to analyze what all happened. I know I really wanted to do both days, but I'm just going to have to do this first game for now, and I'll work on analyzing and writing another script so that I can explain what went wrong with the second game. Hopefully we'll have some better games ahead in the season. I know we're a lot better than we were last season, but we could still use quite a bit of work. Talk to you guys later.